create this monumental event. Good evening and congratulations, Durham. On behalf of the Occaneechi Band of the Saponi Nation, we are pleased to share in this celebration of Durham's 150th anniversary tonight. The Occaneechi shared a similar language with the Eno, Saponi, and Catawba tribes. As much as I'd like to greet you in that language, I can't because the language died in the early 1800s. Some of our people are trying to revive it, so I will be just content tonight and say, welcome and happy anniversary. This area has been populated for thousands of years. In a time before, the Occaneechi lived along the Roanoke River between what is now North Carolina and Virginia. In the mid-1600s, we migrated south and west from the Roanoke River Basin to an area that came to be called Occaneechi Town, beside the Eno River in present-day Hillsboro. We lived here before you. As European settlement encroached, we lived around you. As settlement grew, we lived nearby you. When the settlements grew more numerous, we lived among you. Today, as we celebrate your 150th anniversary, we live with you. We have adapted and made a place for ourselves in modern society. We are extremely proud to join you tonight as a living reminder that we are still here. Welcome. And now, imagine a time before.
Durham is a city of approximately 275,000 residents, covering about 108 square miles in northeast central North Carolina. Its city center lies along a ridge separating the Neuse and Cape Fear River watersheds at latitude 36 degrees north and longitude 79 degrees west. The area's earliest settlers are today referred to by historians as the Paleo-Indians. As long as 12,000 years ago, they came into dense forest gathering fruit, seeds, nuts, and hunting turkey, bear, and deer. Fishing was also an important food source. Time went by, and these Native Americans began to practice agriculture. They cleared land to make room for corn, beans, and squash, and settled into villages beside their fields, often on the banks of rivers like the Eno. In the vicinity of the future Durham lived the Siouan-speaking Eno and Occaneechi people. In 1670, the explorer John Lederer became the first European to leave a first-hand account of how they lived. Quote, "Their town is built round a field. They plant an abundance of grain, reap 3 crops in a summer, and out of their granaries supply all of the adjacent parts. Their government is democratic, and the sentences of their old men are received as laws." Europeans brought trade goods, but also a time of change. In the early 1700s, most of this area's natives moved to Fort Christiana in Virginia. Some returned in the 1750s, finding their former country taken over by European settlers and colonial laws. They settled in what is now northern Orange and Alamance counties, in what came to be called the Texas community. Their descendants remain there to this day, assimilated into the general population, but still working to preserve their tribal heritage. Most of the first white settlers in the Durham area arrived by way of the Great Trading Path, an ancient network of trails that ran from the James River to the Savannah River through what is now northern Durham County. Present-day Interstate 85 closely parallels this prehistoric route of commerce. William Few, who came from Maryland to settle the Eno River, recorded his first impressions. Quote, "We found a mild and healthy climate and fertile lands, but our establishment was in the woods. In that country at that time, there were no schools, no churches, or parsons." Accounts from the early 1750s mention inns and taverns in what is now Durham County. A newcomer named Michael Sinnott built the area's first recorded grist mill on the Eno River within modern-day West Point Park. William Johnston built a store on the trading path at the Snow Hill Plantation, which lent its name to the present Snow Hill Road. Johnston hired a Virginian named Richard Benehan to manage his store, and Benehan, who had an eye to the future, began to acquire land. But before too many years went by, events far away would sweep North Carolina and its backcountry into the Revolutionary War. Richard Benehan joined the Patriot cause, leaving directions with a friend, James Martin. Quote, "Should anything prevent my ever returning, my will and all my cash, papers, etc., are in my little blue trunk standing on the chest of drawers. Mr. Johnston, who is now in his bed very sick, begs your care and attention to his mill and everything about his plantation." Benehan survived, liberty was won for some, and the region grew.
Oh, Emma, oh, you turn around, dig a hole in the ground. Oh, Emma,
In the north, more plantations developed. Benehan's own Stagville, under the successive management of his son-in-law Duncan Cameron and grandson Paul Cameron, by 1860 covered 30,000 acres with almost 900 enslaved persons. A portion of their land and the old Oxford Highway is now the Stagville State Historic Site. In the south, farms were smaller, though one landowner, Richard Stanford Lee, built his holdings on New Hope Creek to almost 1,000 acres. Lee Farm, with its 1835 farmhouse, is now a city historic park off NC 54 near Interstate 40. In between, near Ellerby Creek, a young farmer was establishing his homestead on land he received as a wedding present. His name was Washington Duke. A portion of that property, including Duke's 1852 home place, is now another state historic site. A road between Hillsborough and Raleigh ran along the ridge between the Neuse and Cape Fear watersheds. Near the present-day 9th Street stood the community of Pinhook, with a tavern that gave the ridge the reputation of a roaring old place, drawing revelers from as far away as the University in Chapel Hill. To the east was another settlement of dubious reputation, Prattsburg, known for drinking, tippling, playing at cards, and generally disturbing the peace and dignity of the state. In between Pinhook and Prattsburg in the late 1840s, young Dr. Bartlett Durham bought 100 acres and began his medical practice. Shortly thereafter, surveyors and engineers came to plan a railroad line. Needing a location for a fuel and water stop, they approached Dr. Durham, who provided 4 acres for what became officially Durham Station. One of his patients described Dr. Durham as a fine, portly-looking man, a jovial fellow. On moonshiny nights, he would gather a group of boys together and serenade the town. In those days, there were about a dozen families. A village had begun to form at Durham Station. Entrepreneur Robert Morris came from Hillsborough to open a hotel, and in 1858, with his son, joined newcomer Wesley Wright as partners in Durham's first manufactory of smoking tobacco. Then came 1861, and with it the Civil War. Boys signed up to fight in what they thought would be a brief affray. On their way to join Confederate forces, one local unit stopped near present-day Bahama to pay respects to retired United States Senator Willie P. Mangum. Boys, the old man told them, you can't win. He was right. In 1865, the war came to Durham Station. Union General William Tecumseh Sherman occupied Raleigh, and Union cavalry occupied Durham Station. Retreating Confederate General Joseph Johnston asked Sherman for a ceasefire to negotiate an end to the hostilities. Sherman agreed, and the two commanders met at the farmhouse of James and Nancy Bennett on the Hillsborough-Raleigh Road, 4.5 miles west of Durham Station. On April 26th, Johnston and Sherman signed the largest Confederate surrender of the war, involving more than 80,000 Southern soldiers. That location is now the Bennett Place State Historic Site. At some point, while the generals conferred with each other and then with their respective superiors, idle soldiers broke into the tobacco factory at Durham Station, owned by a man named John Ruffin Green. They took his entire stock of prized white-leaf tobacco. Green thought he was ruined. Instead, it was a bonanza for Green and for the town. The soldiers liked Green's golden blend, and after they reached home, they wrote back inquiring how they could get more of that Durham tobacco. All of a sudden, the local leaf was in demand and entrepreneurs rushed to capitalize on it. By 1869, there were 7 manufacturers producing brands such as Our Durham, Plucky Durham, Pride of Durham, Duke of Durham, and Green's own Genuine Durham, with its distinctive bull logo. While most of the South languished in devastation, Durham had energy and enterprise to burn, thanks to Brightleaf tobacco. Things looked so bullish that on April 10, 1869, the state legislature officially incorporated the village as a city, and Durham, North Carolina was born.
The war is over. For people who do their duty and stick to their business, there has never been a better opportunity than the time we are living in right now. Washington Duke, my father, perhaps you've heard of him, after the war, he walked 134 miles from New Bern back to the farm, which is damn amazing, but not the point at all. The point is what he did when he got back. He sold all the livestock, horses too, traded the plantation, basically sold or bartered everything we had, and took his payment in tobacco. I know, folks said he was crazy, called him a fool. Washington Duke is a lot of things, but a fool he is not. For if he was, that would make me the son of a fool. I, Brodie Leonidas Duke, am a man answering the knock of that elusive, stunningly beautiful mistress, Opportunity.
Dr. Shepard, a young man asked me once at a conference in Philadelphia, why are the Negroes in Durham so successful? I was able to answer this gentleman with one word: faith. It was faith that brought us together to build Hayti. Faith that built Mechanics and Farmers, the North Carolina Mutual, business after business, home after home. Faith that built this beautiful house of worship. But faith must come with something. Scripture tells us this: faith without works is dead. So we keep working. Numerous are our goals for our families, for our community, for our people.
I'm about the future. Like I said, the war is over. We lost. You lose sometimes. I lost my mother, a brother, but life goes on. A lot of folks, they want to refight the war through conversation, but I'll tell you, just like I tell them, ain't no money in that. But there is money in that good Durham tobacco leaf. That's why I just bought myself a building, 2 stories. Plan to live upstairs and sell my tobacco on the bottom. Pretty soon I'll be buying another, and then on and on. Live in yesterday, or build for the future. I'm standing in the building for tomorrow line with warehouses of golden leaf tobacco to sell. How about you?
The future for us is education. And on that front, great progress has been made. As you all know, a few years back, I was able to travel to Africa and Europe, attending conferences and the like, in regards to the educating of Sunday school teachers. While in Rome, I was inspired with the idea of creating such an educational institution here in Durham for the advancement of our people. I am proud to say today, just 3 years later, the Religious Training School in Chautauqua is offering education to our people not only in religious studies, but also in foreign language and medicine. This is only the beginning. From the land of resilience,
The possibilities never end.
Traveled back to 1870 and arrived by train at Durham Station at the corner of Pettigrew and Blackwell Streets. Where the old Bull Building now stands is the late John Green's tobacco factory, now taken over by the W.T. Blackwell Company. Beyond that, a farm belonging to fellow tobacco manufacturer Robert Morris. Cross the track and walk uphill along today's Corcoran Street to the Hillsborough Road, now Main Street. The 21C Museum Hotel is a horse lot. One city center is a barnyard and stable. At Main and Mangum Streets, you find the beginnings of a business district, a store, a blacksmith shop, sawmill and cotton gin, 2 churches, 3 saloons, and a scattering of storehouses and homes. Surrounding it all, farmland and forest. Newly incorporated under the Reconstruction legislature, Durham covered 1 square mile with the North Carolina Railroad Depot at the center. Tobacco merchant J.W. Cheek is the city's first mayor, an office then known as Magistrate of Police. Only 250 people live in the village that is developed near Durham Station, but there are signs of the future in the multiplying manufactories of fragrant smoking tobacco. On his farm, Washington Duke has taken up tobacco manufacturing since coming home from the Civil War. With his sons Ben and James Buchanan, or Buck, and daughter Mary, Duke produces a brand called Pro Bono Publico. Duke's eldest, Brodie, has already struck out on his own, moving to town and setting up a factory on Main Street to manufacture his Duke of Durham blend. Brodie joins half a dozen other manufacturers in Durham, who together employ almost 100 hands and produce almost $135,000 worth of processed tobacco that year. A decade later, the number of manufacturers will have doubled, their payrolls risen to 870, and the value of their production to almost $1 million. Meanwhile, other institutions have taken shape. Less than a mile from the station, south of the tracks on the Fayetteville Road, a community of African Americans springs up after the war's end. Methodist evangelist Eddie and Markham arrived in 1868, bought a plot of land, opened a freedmen's school, and put up a brush arbor for worship services. Markham's brush arbor joined a congregation grown out of a Sunday school that Baptist Margaret Fawcett organized in her home. Together, the 2 congregations grew to become St. Joseph's AME and White Rock Baptist churches, and around them, a community of African American landowners took shape called Hayti.
Oh, freedom.
Establishing congregations of their own was one way liberated African Americans expressed the freedom that came with emancipation. A new state constitution adopted under Congressional Reconstruction in 1868 mandated the right to vote for black men as well as white, and assured freedmen of basic legal rights. African Americans won some local offices in the election of 1868, particularly in eastern North Carolina. But the true state of race relations was symbolized in an 1876 tobacco plant advertisement for a saloon in Durham. There, the ad declared patrons would find one section reserved for white gentlemen and a separate section for colored persons. Although racial separation had quickly become social convention after Reconstruction, African Americans continued to vote and hold office. For a while, the prospect of racial equality and harmony between black and white seemed not outside the realm of possibility. In the mid-1890s, a multiracial coalition of Republicans and populists called Fusionists won control of North Carolina government from the white supremacist Democrats who'd held power for 20 years. Conservative whites reacted with violent racist campaigns in 1898 and 1900, raising fears of what they called Negro domination and calling on white men to, quote, do their duty. The strategy worked. White Democrats were swept back into control. North Carolina, along with other southern states, enacted harsh Jim Crow laws that denied African Americans their right to vote, mandated segregation in public accommodations, schools, and even water fountains. Racial segregation would be the rule for decades to come. In the 1880s, the pace of growth and development continues rapidly. Over the next decade, Durham's population increases to more than 2,000 and to more than 5,000 by 1890. Energy and enterprise burst out all over. In 1870, the W.T. Blackwell Company takes on a new partner, young Julian Shakespeare Carr from Chapel Hill, whose flair for promotion builds the genuine Durham smoking tobacco into an international brand. Blackwell opens a tobacco market where farmers bring their crop for auction to the highest bidders among Durham's manufacturers. Washington Duke sees the future and brings his business and family into town, with young Buck Duke aiming to, as he put it, tame the bull. Durham gains its own newspaper in 1872, the aptly named Tobacco Plant. Eugene Moorhead opens Durham's first bank. The city opens its first offices above Atlas Rigsby's store and establishes a public cemetery for whites just outside the city limits on the Chapel Hill Road. Excluded from the public graveyard, in 1877, several African American residents buy land north of town to establish what became known as the Geer Cemetery. It served the black community until the city opened Beechwood Cemetery in 1925. A black fraternal lodge, the Royal Knights of King David, offers life and burial insurance for its members and inspires African American entrepreneurs such as John Merrick, who was born in slavery and raised himself to become president of the largest Negro life insurance company in the world. John Merrick taught himself to read, write, and figure as a youngster. At 18, he went as a brick mason to help build Shaw University in Raleigh, then learned the barber's trade and moved to Durham on the advice of members of the Duke family. In Durham, with his partner John Wright, Merrick opened 6 barber shops, 3 for black customers and 3 for whites. Money he earned from the shops he put into real estate, buying property in Hayti and building modest homes for African Americans there, then buying lots in the heart of downtown on Paris Street, the future Black Wall Street. In 1898, Merrick, with Dr. Aaron McDuffie Moore and 5 other African American men, founded the North Carolina Mutual and Provident Association, which later became NC Mutual Life Insurance. Merrick and Moore changed the name and paid claims out of their own pockets after the other 5 investors backed out. Merrick became the company's first president and then served until his death in 1919. A Merrick protege and successor at the Mutual, C.C. Spaulding, a nephew of Aaron Moore, was a prominent interracial leader who received citations from Presidents Franklin Roosevelt and Harry Truman. He came to Durham from Columbus County in 1896. He joined the Mutual 4 years later and worked there as an agent, general inspector, general manager, and secretary-treasurer before taking over as company president in 1923. In 1935, Spaulding founded and led the Durham Committee on Negro Affairs, now the Durham Committee on the Affairs of Black People, which molded African American voters into a potent political force. He served as president of Mechanics and Farmers Bank and the Mutual Savings and Loan Association, and helped found what today is North Carolina Central University. Merrick and Spaulding had a fellow entrepreneur in Richard Burton Fitzgerald, a self-made millionaire and philanthropist who played a major role in racial economic uplift. Born a free man of color in Delaware, Fitzgerald was a Union veteran of the Civil War who moved south during Reconstruction and with his brother Robert opened a brick-making business. Attracted to Durham by the opportunities in a fast-growing and building city, Fitzgerald supplied the tobacco and textile industry's demand for bricks. By 1886, his firm was turning out 30,000 bricks a day, which went into such landmarks as Irwin Mills and St. Joseph's AME Church. Fitzgerald was the first president of Mechanics and Farmers Bank, and turning to real estate, he developed homes for African Americans in the West End section of Durham. In the face of discrimination in the textile industry, he served as president of the first American cotton mill built, owned, and operated by African Americans, the Coleman Manufacturing Company in Concord, North Carolina. Much is to come for Durham, which becomes a county seat when legislators from the city maneuver the General Assembly into turning eastern Orange County into Durham County in 1881. A Jewish community had begun to form in the 1870s with the arrival of several merchants who opened dry goods, grocery, and clothing stores. The Jewish presence was large enough by 1887 to organize a Durham Hebrew congregation and to establish a Hebrew cemetery adjoining Maplewood. Meeting for its first decades in rented space, the congregation bought a former church building on Liberty Street in 1905 to found the city's first synagogue. Durham in those days had some aspects of a Wild West boom town. Saloons were numerous, disputes were often settled by fisticuffs, and the newspaper inveighed against the habit of spitting tobacco juice in church. Legend holds that one early mayor fined himself for holding court while drunk. Hog pens lined unpaved streets, which turned into quagmires in rainy weather. Most buildings were wooden, so fires were a constant hazard, with no town fire company until 1880 and no town water system until 1888. Yet Durham was taking on a degree of culture. Public schools, one for white children and one for black children, opened in the 1880s. One of Durham's school teachers is remembered as a role model for all children. Louisa Whitted Burton taught grammar school, then English at Hillside High School, the only high school for African Americans in the area. At Hillside, she also served as Dean of Girls from 1926 until her death in 1932, and the school's de facto assistant principal, one of the first African American women in North Carolina to carry such authority in education. Born to enslaved parents in Hillsborough, Louisa was the only girl among 9 children of Sally Kane and Alston Whitted. She was one of the first women admitted to Shaw University and graduated from what was called the school's Etsy Seminary for Women. After graduating, she came to teach in Durham, where her brother James was the city's first African-American principal and colored superintendent of schools. Her memory is carried on in the name of Burton Elementary School. Durham joined the Industrial Revolution as entrepreneurs such as Julian Carr and Brodie Duke built cotton mills, and James B. Duke mechanized production of the newly fashionable cigarettes. One of Duke's new Bonsack rolling machines could turn out as many cigarettes in a day as 48 workers could by hand, allowing W. Duke, Sons and Company to undercut competitors' prices. Once the machines went to work in Durham, 1884, Buck Duke left to open a factory in New York City. He goes on to create the giant American Tobacco Company that dominates the American tobacco industry into the 20th century, finally taking over the old Blackwell Durham firm and its Bull Durham brand in 1899. The dominance lasts until 1911, when the Supreme Court, in an antitrust ruling, breaks American into 5 smaller firms. The old Blackwell factory goes to a new, smaller American Tobacco, while the old Duke factory goes to competitor Liggett & Myers. Back in the 1800s, businessmen formed the Commonwealth Club for promoting commerce and the Lyceum for cultural pursuits. The classically trained Celestia Southgate starts the St. Cecilia Society to cultivate a taste for art music. By the end of the 1800s, Durham has the Southern Conservatory of Music at the corner of Duke and Main Streets, and at 5 Points, a free public library, a first in North Carolina. Still, the old image of a roaring old place endures. When North Carolina Baptists seek to locate a new college for women, Durham interests offer $50,000 and land if they will make our city its home. The offer is rejected on the grounds that the young factory town is no fit place for girls in their formative years. So Meredith University now stands in West Raleigh. But Durham gets a second chance. The Methodist Trinity College has an ambitious young president, John Crowell, who wants to move the school from rustic Randolph County to an urban environment. Durham Methodist, Washington Duke, and Julian Carr offer $85,000 and a tract of land, respectively, and Trinity opens up what is now East Campus in October of 1892. Across town, and a few years later, another Duke, Brodie, will donate land for another institution. What is now North Carolina Central University opened as the National Religious Training School in Chautauqua. It was the creation of Dr. James E. Shepherd. The son of a minister, Shepherd graduated from Shaw University with degrees in pharmacy. He helped establish the Durham Drug Company as well as North Carolina Mutual, and besides practicing his profession, ran a real estate investment firm. Then he plunged into church work. In 1905, he became a field representative of an international Sunday school organization, and in 1907 made an extensive tour abroad, visiting Europe and Africa, and speaking at a World Sunday School convention. Shepherd came home determined to found a school for training Sunday school teachers and missionaries, along with providing cultural enrichment for African Americans in Durham. Shepherd and his associates in the city's black business community raised $25,000 to get started, and the school opened July 6, 1910. But financial troubles plagued the institution despite reorganizations and philanthropy. Shepherd convinced state authorities to adopt the school in 1923, and thus it became the nation's first state-supported liberal arts institution for African Americans. Shepherd continued as college president until his death in 1947. By the time the future North Carolina Central opened, development had spread beyond the city limits, and in 1901, Durham's first annexation raises its population to 18,000. 3 new railroads serve businesses and share a new ornate Union Station at the foot of Church Street. Richard H. Wright's electric streetcars carry residents to home and work, to the baseball park on Driver Street, and the amusement park at Lakewood. Women defying social conventions that kept their place at home have gained voices and influence in their churches. They founded chapters of the Charitable King's Daughters and the Women's Christian Temperance Union, gaining a liberating momentum that sees them taking jobs previously denied them during World War I, and even winning admission to the Chamber of Commerce in 1919. The future City of Medicine gains its first hospital in 1895, donated by Duke business partner George Washington Watts. But this is an era of racial segregation, and Watts Hospital serves only whites. It is 6 more years before Durham gains Lincoln Hospital for African Americans, largely through the drive of Dr. Aaron McDuffie Moore. The first African American physician to practice in Durham, Moore received his medical training at Shaw University and achieved the 2nd highest score among 40 applicants taking the state medical examination. Fresh out of medical school at age 25, Moore came to Durham in 1888 and became a civic and philanthropic leader as well as a doctor. With John Merrick, he organized the Durham Drug Company to train pharmacists as well as dispense medicines. He was a co-founder of North Carolina Mutual Insurance, serving as president from 1919 until his death in 1923. Moore and Merrick were also among the founders of Mechanics at Farmers Bank. Together, they also established the Durham Negro Observer newspaper and signed on the charter of North Carolina Central University. It was Moore who led efforts to get funding for a black hospital, eventually gaining support from Ben and James B. Duke. Moore, appropriately, became Lincoln Hospital's superintendent when it opened in the Hayti neighborhood in 1901. Besides the hospital, Moore gave Durham's African Americans their first library, setting it up in the Sunday school at White Rock Baptist Church in 1913. Eventually taken over by the county library system, Moore's creation is today's Stanford L. Warren Library on Fayetteville Street. In 1912, the African-American scholar W.E.B. Du Bois pays a visit to Durham and writes about it in The Independent, a national magazine. He concludes that in Durham, a black man may get up in the morning from a mattress made by black men, in a house which a black man built, out of lumber which black man cut and planed. He may put on a suit which he bought at a colored haberdashery, and socks knit at a colored mill. He may cook victuals from a colored grocery on a stove which black men fashioned. He may earn his living working for colored men, be sick in a colored hospital, and buried from a colored church, and the Negro Insurance Company will pay his widow enough to keep his children in a colored school. This is surely progress. Progress is a byword in Durham. It even goes up in lights. In 1913, the electric utility, the Durham Traction Company, donates to the city a slogan sign. Standing more than 30 feet high on top of a downtown building, the illuminated sign flashes a message. Durham, renowned the world around. Health, wealth, success, progress. On a Monday night in December, a crowd estimated at 10,000 people gathered to see the sign lit up for the first time. Dignitaries were eloquent. Shops did a brisk business. Costumed revelers paraded. The atmosphere was electric. And then it was time. Mayor W.J. Brogdon flipped a switch. The green and amber border lights came on. Then, renowned the world around in white, and health, wealth, success, and progress in bright red. But no Durham. Was it modesty? Stage fright? A bad connection? There were anxious moments, there were hoots and jeers, and then, in its own good time, the lights flash off. Durham.
Merry Christmas, Cole.
The whole of the United States of America is broke on account of some bankers and money folk been doing things they ought not to have been doing. Now the rest of us regular folk are stuck paying the price for their mischief. And it's a price that we can't afford to pay. My sister down in New Bern wrote me a letter and said that they just killed their last hog, and her husband's looking to tenant farm. There's not much else he can do. Folks is desperate. We was in a bad way around here as well until recently. But we will have a decent dinner tonight, though. My husband used to threaten our son with a strap to get him to eat his green beans. He does not have to do that anymore. My son will eat whatever you put on his plate before you can even put it down. You think that would make me happy? But it actually makes me very sad. It reminds me of what we lost. The ability to be choosy about the tiniest of things, like what foods you like and which ones you don't.
They're gonna be able to save Timmy's foot. I'm just so thankful. Timmy's all his mother has. His father's in Europe somewhere fighting. Colored troops fighting and dying now, and no wife or mother knows when they're gonna get that letter. Now, in the midst of all that, imagine your 12-year-old son nearly cutting off his foot while trying to chop wood for fire, hoping to fight back against that unforgiving cold. Cold that seems to find every nook and cranny to enter through in a poorly built shack. I can't even comprehend what Timmy's mother has endured. But we were able to save her boy, and I thank God we were here to do it. We are the only colored hospital for miles. If Timmy wasn't able to make it here, to Durham, he would have lost that foot, and most likely his life.
We're Baptist. We believe in the power of prayer. We believe in the goodness of people and the goodness in people. My husband John was out of the job for a while after the buildings he was working on at Trinity College were done. He's a carpenter by trade, but people don't have money for cabinetry or anything like that these days. We're scared. We weren't sure if we were going to make it. But through our church and our neighbors, we made it through. And now John's gone on to work with the Civilian and Conservation Corps. He's building truck trails in Duke Forest and Chapel Hill. $30 a month. So we will have meat to go with those green beans tonight. Meat that I'll share with Dorothy. Her husband died in an accident at the mill. She's got 3 little kids and no one to help her.
This hospital almost wasn't built. In fact, the funds the Duke family gave to help start this hospital was initially slated for a monument to memorialize the colored troops that fought on the side of the Confederacy, as if those slaves had a choice. The argument had to be made that a healthy colored community was a great benefit to the white community. Influenza knows no colored lines. With colored folks working in white households and in close proximity to whites, refusal to help protect colored people's health put white people's health at risk. So Lincoln Hospital was built. Our mission, provide care regardless of whether or not someone can afford it. From the land of the resilient.
The possibilities never end.
When Trinity College opened for its fall term in 1924, President William Preston Few declared that never before have all indications pointed toward a more promising year. If anything, that was an understatement. In December, James Buchanan Duke announced creation of the $40 million Duke Endowment, with almost 1/3 of its proceeds going to transform the college into Duke University. The same day that news came out, Durham voters affirmed another extension of the city limits, raising the population to more than 50,000 and making Durham the 4th largest city in North Carolina. For the next decade, work went on to rebuild the old Trinity campus and construct a whole new campus a mile to the west, with a medical school and a hospital and Duke's soaring Gothic chapel. A flurry of building was already transforming Durham's downtown. At the present site of CCB Plaza, the old Academy of Music, which housed a concert hall and city offices above an open-air meat market, was torn down to make way for the 16-story Washington Duke Hotel. On Paris Street, North Carolina Mutual had opened a new 6-story headquarters in 1921. A new Central High School had opened on Duke Street, and the former White High School on Morris Street became Durham's first city hall. Next door, the magnificent Durham Auditorium went up, soon to be better known as the Carolina Theater. A new baseball field, El Toro Park, opened at Morris and Corporation Streets in 1926, followed by a new Greek Revival library on East Main. Activist citizens formed a playground commission in 1924, prompting the city to create a recreation department. A new city charter, approved after women won the vote, brought professional administration to local government in the person of Durham's first city manager, Robert W. Rigsby, hired in 1921. Women moved further into the public sphere with efforts ranging from beautification to investigating child labor conditions in the city's textile mills. One of America's most accomplished women was then growing up in the West End and going to Hillside High School. The Reverend Polly Murray was born in Baltimore and came to Durham to live with her grandparents, Robert and Cornelia Fitzgerald. Graduating from Hillside in 1926, she moved to New York to attend Hunter College and began writing and publishing magazine articles and poetry. She also involved herself in the nascent civil rights movement. As a Howard University law student, she joined other African Americans to form the Congress of Racial Equality in 1941 and joined civil rights demonstrations in the District of Columbia. NAACP attorney Thurgood Marshall called Murray's 1951 book, States' Laws on Race and Color, a Bible for civil rights lawyers. Also an advocate for what's now called the LGBTQ community and for women's rights, Murray was a co-founder of the National Organization for Women and coined the term Jane Crow to denote the particular oppression felt by African American women. She also became deeply involved in the Episcopal Church and in 1977 became the first African American woman ordained an Episcopal priest. As a priest, she celebrated her first Eucharist at the Chapel of the Cross in Chapel Hill, the same church where her grandmother had been baptized as a slave. In 2012, the Episcopal Church recognized her as a saint. African American activism was going on in 1930s Durham as well. In 1933, North Carolina College graduate Thomas Hocutt applied to the University of North Carolina's Pharmacy School in the first challenge to segregated higher education in the South. His application failed, as did a subsequent lawsuit, but Hocutt's attempt would inform later efforts to break through Jim Crow. On another front, in 1935, North Carolina Mutual President C.C. Spaulding and others formed the Durham Committee on Negro Affairs, now the Durham Committee on the Affairs of Black People, to address the problems of the black community and build political power. Largely due to the committee, within 4 years, more than half of Durham's eligible African Americans were registered to vote, while pressure was brought on the city to improve housing, parks, schools, and public safety for African American citizens. Lewis Ernest Austin was another key figure in the long struggle for African American rights. A native of Enfield, North Carolina, Austin came to Durham in 1917 to attend what is now North Carolina Central University. After college, he became an agent for North Carolina Mutual, but changed careers in 1927. That year, he used a loan from Mechanics and Farmers Bank to buy the Carolina Times newspaper and began a lifelong campaign for decency and dignity for African Americans and against segregation, discrimination, and white supremacy. His paper's motto was, "The Truth Unbridled." Austin's office on Pettigrew Street was a headquarters for civil rights activists in Durham as he pressed the city to hire black policemen, firemen, and bus drivers and pay black teachers the same salaries as whites. He advocated for Thomas Hocutt's attempt to integrate the University of North Carolina. In 1934, he became one of the first African American magistrates elected in the South. He helped found the Durham Committee on Negro Affairs, and in 1953 served as a publicist in Rencher N. Harris's successful campaign to become the first black member of Durham City Council. When Austin died in 1971, the North Carolina legislature honored him with a proclamation as one of the state's most distinguished and honorable citizens. His legacy is carried on by the Carolina Times, now a third-generation family-owned newspaper. African Americans were not alone in pressing for a better life. Labor organizing, which had been sporadic in Durham since the 1880s, gained encouragement in the 1930s as the federal government's New Deal established collective bargaining as a right. Durham textile workers, facing pay cuts as well as demands for greater productivity, joined a nationwide general strike in 1934 that idled 5,200 employees for several weeks, but ended without workers making any gains. Duke University construction and undiminished demand for cigarettes cushioned the Depression in Durham, but its effects were felt by business people as well as labor. Fearing a run on his Durham Bank and Trust, John Sprunt Hill restored public confidence by passing cash out a back window to friends who would then come in the front door and make hefty deposits in view of other customers. Hill also boosted the Depression-era economy by building a new headquarters for his bank, now home to the 21C Museum Hotel. Rising 17 stories in the heart of downtown, the Hill Building was designed by the New York firm Shreve, Lamb & Harmon, which earlier had designed the Empire State Building in association with Durham architect George Watts Carr. It opened in 1937. In the fall, during tobacco auction season, Durham's warehouse district along Rigsby Avenue supported a vibrant culture of street corner preachers, patent medicine hawkers, political hopefuls, and sidewalk musicians. In the 1930s and 40s, the Bowl City was a mecca for players of the Piedmont Blues, a lively, good-time form of urban folk music distinct from its plaintive relation in Delta, Mississippi. After the warehouses closed, there were liquor houses and parties that would pay for dance tunes. Bluesmen could manage a living in spite of the era's hard times. Several went on to become recording artists who were well known in their own time, then rediscovered during the folk music revival of the 1960s. Two of the best were the Reverend Gary Davis and Blind Boy Fuller. Davis and Fuller, who is also known as Fulton Allen, have influenced folk artists around the world, epitomizing the Piedmont blues style and recording songs later covered by artists such as Bob Dylan, the Grateful Dead, Peter, Paul and Mary, the Everly Brothers, and Kev Moe. Both performed on the streets of Durham. Both enjoyed commercial success in their lifetimes.
Just don't have no mercy in this land. It don't have no mercy in this land. When it comes to your house, it won't stay.
Davis, an ordained Baptist minister, sang gospel songs as well as blues. He's known for his skill on harmonica and banjo and a unique finger-picking style on guitar. Among his recordings were Cocaine Blues, Death Don't Have No Mercy, Maple Leaf Rag, and Samson and Delilah. Fuller, who learned a great deal from Davis, recorded more than 120 songs between 1935 and 1941, such as Step It Up and Go, Rag Mama Rag, Truckin' My Blues Away, and Get Your Ya-Ya's Out. His music has been described as full of honesty and uninhibited, reflecting his own life experience as a blind black man in the South.
This baby looking for a needle in the sand. Looking for a woman ain't got no better.
An African-American artist in another field was photographer Alex Rivera. In 1939, Dr. James Shepard hired Rivera to set up the first news bureau at what is now North Carolina Central University. Rivera, a Greensboro native, had been a photojournalist for the Washington Tribune. During World War II, Rivera served in naval intelligence, and then went to work for the National Negro Press Association and the Pittsburgh Courier, a nationally prominent black-owned paper. Rivera covered the South, winning acclaim for his documentation of lynchings, legal challenges to segregation, and the aftermath of the Supreme Court's Brown versus the Board of Education decision. In 1949, he wrote for Ebony magazine on the black-owned businesses on Durham's Parish Street. His article was titled, Wall Street of Negro America. Over the years, Rivera photographed leaders and celebrities such as opera singer Marian Anderson, tennis star Arthur Ashe, Ethiopian Emperor Haile Selassie, and U.S. Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall. He accompanied President Richard Nixon on a trip to Africa in 1975. At Rivera's invitation, President Gerald Ford attended NCCU's Founders Day celebration. When Rivera retired as the university's public relations director in 1993, Governor Jim Hunt awarded him the state's highest honor, the Order of the Longleaf Pine. In the 1920s and 30s, another African American was making a major mark in Durham, though he probably never set foot in town. Julian Francis Abel of Philadelphia was the designer of Duke University's West Campus. Abel was chief designer at the Horace Trumbauer architectural firm, which had designed Buck Duke's Fifth Avenue home in New York. Trained at the University of Pennsylvania and in Europe, Abel produced designs for the Widener Library at Harvard and Philadelphia Museum of Art, as well as such iconic Duke buildings as Duke Chapel, Cameron Indoor Stadium, Gothic dormitories, and classroom buildings. There is no record of Abel ever coming to Jim Crow-era Durham to see his work realized in a university he would not have been allowed to attend, and his contribution to Duke was little known around the campus until the 1980s. The main West Campus quadrangle was named for Abel in 2016. Abel's designs also included Duke's football stadium, where Coach Wallace Wade was making Duke into a national power in the 1930s. His 1938 team, nicknamed the Iron Dukes, were undefeated, untied, and unscored upon until the last minute of a Rose Bowl loss to Southern California. The 1941 season brought a second Rose Bowl bid and brought home to Durham the effects of World War II. When it looked like fear of a Japanese attack would cancel the game, Duke and Durham offered to host it in what is now Wallace Wade Stadium. And so it happened. January 1st, 1942 became the only time the Rose Bowl has been played outside Pasadena, California. That game, Duke lost to Oregon State. The war's more serious effects were not long in coming. Civilian observers kept eyes out for enemy planes. Air raid drills were frequent, and the city put up extra security on businesses doing defense work. A campaign driven in large part by Frank Pearson, the Secretary of Durham's Chamber of Commerce, led the U.S. Army to build Camp Butner. It was built on more than 30,000 acres of prime tobacco land in Granville, Person, and Durham counties, about 15 miles north of the city. Hundreds of property owners and residents in the area tried to mobilize opposition, but their petitions, personal calls on the War Department, and front porch stands with shotgun in hand were no help. More than 400 Durham County families were forced off their land, some of whom had been there for generations, leaving a long-term residue of bad feelings to go with the anticipated economic boost from camp construction and from 35,000 GIs and civilian employees on the camp payroll. The camp also brought stresses. Soldiers and camp workers' families streamed into Durham, exhausting the stock of rental housing. As many as 4,000 GIs could be found in the city on any given day looking for recreation. Arrests rose for morals offenses. One Saturday, what was described as a sea of khaki swept in and had bought up every bottle of legal liquor in the town by lunchtime. 4 USO clubs, 3 for white soldiers and 1 for black, offered some comforts of home, but Southern social customs led to violent clashes in 1943. City authorities needed the State Guard and military police to control a riot that broke out in Hayti after a white ABC official confronted an African-American soldier over his supply of liquor ration books. A year later, black GI Booker T. Spicely was shot and killed by a white bus driver after a dispute over seating. An all-white jury found the driver not guilty. Such events led an interracial group of ministers to form and encourage what they called racial cooperation. They also led the city to grant the African-American community a gesture it had sought for years. Black police patrolmen Clyde Cox and Alan Samuel walked their first beat on July 20th, 1944.